Let's discuss troubleshooting Windows lockups. Now there's two different types of lockups you need to be concerned with. The first one is just a simple lockup. With a simple lockup, you're working along, everything's going great, then all of a sudden everything freezes. You can't type anymore, your mouse doesn't work, everything is locked up solid. And this can be caused by a variety of different things. With Windows XP, this is not really that big a problem anymore. My experience has been that eventually something will happen in the system and the lockup will resolve itself. Many times this is caused by CPU overutilization. Some process or application is running the CPU at 100%, or it's using up so many interrupts that the system doesn't have time to do anything else. This is especially true if you've got very intensive disk operations going on. If you're writing a ton of data to the disk, you can have a simple lockup. Many times with Windows XP, this will resolve itself if you just wait a few minutes. Occasionally it won't, and you will have to manually power down the system and bring it back up. And usually that actually fixes the lockup. Many times it won't reappear. The second type of lockup that you probably encounter when using Windows is a spontaneous reboot. Now this one actually happens a lot in my experience with Windows XP. You'll be working along, everything's going great, and all of a sudden the system will just shut down and restart. And you're using your hardware troubleshooting skills, you think, I'll bet you I've got a bad power supply. That could be the problem. However, power supplies have been getting better and better. Many times the problem is not with the power supply, but it is with a bad device driver. I've seen this happen a lot with Windows XP. In fact, I have a system back at my office, a special expansion board that I purchased that was quite expensive. I put it in several different Windows XP systems, and that device driver with that particular card would cause every Windows XP system that I put it in to spontaneously reboot after you use the card for just a few minutes. Every single time. It wasn't a matter of if the system would spontaneously reboot, it was a matter of when. I took the card out and put it in a Windows 2000 system using the same device driver that I used with Windows XP. And guess what? Running under Windows 2000, it never has caused any problems. It works perfectly. We use the term bad right here. Maybe bad isn't quite the right term. The problem is with a device driver that isn't terribly compatible with Windows XP. It doesn't play well with Windows XP. Now, there is one other type of Windows lockup that you're going to have to deal with on occasion. These types of lockups are relatively easy to troubleshoot, relatively easy to fix. But the third type can be very difficult, and that is the infamous blue screen of death, affectionately known as a BSOD. If you've used Windows, there's a good chance you've probably seen a blue screen of death at some point. A blue screen of death occurs when a system error has happened that is so severe that Windows can no longer continue, and it stops all processes, halts everything, and pops up a blue screen with white text on it that describes the error in as much detail as the operating system can figure out. These are much more difficult to troubleshoot. So what should you do if a system you're supporting experiences one of these three different types of errors? There's a couple of things. First of all, gather all the details you can about the error. Now, some lockups, such as a blue screen of death, will actually give you an error message. It'll say, something happened here at this certain address, and here's some information. Copy the information reported down exactly. Now, some types of lockups won't give you any information at all, such as a system freeze or a spontaneous reboot. However, a BSOD will. For those other types of lockups, more than likely, you're going to have a Windows reporting event occur that will send a message to Microsoft, and you should go ahead and do that. Send that information to them. So, gather all the details you can. Write down the exact text of any error message. Then check your event log for details about the error. Hopefully there's something there. That's kind of a shot in the dark. Sometimes you'll find information there that will help. Many times there just won't be anything because the error occurred and the event log didn't have time to log an event and save it in its database. The next thing is to note which applications were running and what the user was doing when the lockup occurred. Also note any devices that might be installed in the system and their device driver versions. Many times these will be a culprit as well. Let's take a look at some of the possible causes of a system lockup. Please understand that the list I'm going to give you is not all-inclusive. In fact, you'll see that the causes I'm going to list here are pretty generic, And that's because there are literally thousands of different possible causes for these lockups to occur. It's heavily dependent on which version of the operating system you're using, on what kind of hardware is installed in the operating system, what kind of device drivers you're using, and what applications are installed. The combinations are probably number in the millions. Hence, there's no way we could possibly cover all the different possible causes here. I'm going to give you some generic causes and then some really good steps for finding a resolution that you can apply to just about any situation to determine a resolution. First possible cause, we got a bug in the code. When I say a bug in the code, it could be a bug in the operating system, it could be a bug in an application, it could be a bug in a device driver. We would like to think that all software we purchase is absolutely perfect, but it's not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the need for updates coming from our operating system or application or device driver vendors. It's also possible that you have a corrupt system file somewhere. I haven't seen this happen very often, but when it does, it really causes problems with the system. And it can be very difficult to track down, too, because it can be intermittent. Everything will be working along fine, all of a sudden you'll have this horrendous problem, and it's because there's a system file somewhere. And believe me, when you're dealing with Windows operating system, there are tons of system files. Whenever that system file gets used, then the errors occur. As long as the user doesn't use an application or a service or whatever that requires that particular service, everything works great. As soon as they try to use it, that's when things go nuts. Another thing to watch for is overheated hardware. I have been surprised how often this is actually the culprit. Here's the issue. You've got lots of components inside of your system that generate a lot of heat. This heat must be dissipated for this device to work properly, whether we're talking about a CPU, hard drive, maybe a video board, or an expansion board, or your motherboard itself. The problem is that these devices all carry a static charge, and it attracts dust from the air that's being circulated through the system, and it cakes on to the particular components. If you've ever opened up the PC case and had a hard time finding the CPU because there was so much dust, you know what I'm talking about. This is really a problem, especially in dusty environments. That dust is an insulator. It inhibits the flow of heat from the particular devices in the PC. That can cause a particular device, not the whole system, but maybe one particular device, like your video board or something like that, to get overheated. Becomes too hot, and then it doesn't work properly. And this can cause one of these intermittent buggy Windows lockups, because when you first turn the system on, everything works great, right? Because the device hasn't generated enough heat yet to become a problem. Then as you use the system throughout the day, the heat builds up, starts building up more and more and more, and finally the device starts to operate incorrectly. This is a big one. Don't overlook checking for too much dust inside the system case. It's also possible that a Windows lockup could be caused by a bad or failing hard drive. I've seen this happen before too, quite frequently. Hard drives are mechanical devices. They have mechanical arms, they have mechanical motors. And as a mechanical device, hard drives just wear out over time. Some hard drives have a long mean time before failure rate. Sometimes, depending on the vendor, they have a very short mean time before failure. The important point is that all hard drives will eventually fail after a certain amount of use. When this happens, you'll start seeing very strange errors. You'll start seeing those reboots a lot, as well as lockups. These types of errors are very common with a hard drive that's starting to go bad. Another thing you want to look for, and this is one that's notorious for causing blue screens of death, and that is bad memory. Now, unlike a hard disk drive, memory is not a mechanical device. It's an electronic device completely. It's just made up of capacitors and transistors and such. And as such, usually it lasts longer than the mechanics of a hard drive. But memory has one key weakness, and that is the fact that in order to get as much memory as possible on a memory module, memory manufacturers have been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the devices that go into your memory. The problem is that the smaller they get, the more sensitive they get. and it doesn't take a lot to destroy 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 memory locations inside of a memory module. Excessive heat, maybe a sunspot, shooting a lot of alpha or beta radiation through the device. All those things can cause some of your memory locations to go bad. When that happens, you can end up with a blue screen of death when Windows tries to read or write to a bad memory address. One thing you can look for in this regard, if you keep getting a blue screen of death or some other error message on the screen, and it says encountered error at, and it gives you an address of some sort, it's referencing a memory address. And you need to watch. And if you keep getting the same memory address over and over and over in each of the blue screens of death or error messages that come up, that is a dead giveaway that you've got a bad stick of memory in your system. Every time Windows tries to use it, it generates an error. Irregardless of the cause, your job as a PC technician, and one of your main jobs, frankly, is to find a resolution when these lockups occur. Now, when doing so, you need to accept the fact that there may actually not be a resolution for some of these errors. It may be things that are out of your control, such as a bug in the operating system. There's nothing you can do until your operating system vendor supplies a critical update or a patch that fixes the problem. That said, there are some things you can do. First of all, always install the latest operating system and application updates. In fact, if you call tech support for either Microsoft or an application vendor, the first thing that the tech support guy is going to ask you is, did you install the latest updates? If you have not, they'll say, you know what, go do that, and if you still have the problem, then talk to me. In other words, they're saying, don't talk to me until you've installed the latest updates. So always update your operating system and applications with the latest patches. The next thing to do is update your device drivers. Same issue here. If you haven't updated your hardware's device drivers to the latest version, tech support guys don't want to talk to you. If you've done those things and you're still getting the error, one of the best resources you have is the internet. If we're dealing with a Windows operating system issue, you can go to Microsoft's website and use their knowledge base to track down a resolution to the problem. There's 2 ways you can do this. You can, first of all, just describe the problem and see what comes up. That usually works. Sometimes it's hard to wheedle down the results to the exact problem that you're having. Or if you did what I said earlier and actually wrote down the text of an error message that was displayed on the screen, you can enter the exact text of the error message into the knowledge base search field, and you'll be very likely to find exactly the right document to help you solve the problem. If you're having a problem with an application or a device, then go to the application or device vendor's website and check. More than likely they have either an FAQ or they have a knowledge base of their own that you can search to try to find a resolution to the problem. You'll be surprised at how much information you can gain from vendors' websites. And the reason for that is that tech support guys at these different companies don't like answering your calls. We like to think that they do, but most of the time, frankly, they don't like taking these problems. So, whenever an issue does come up and they track down a solution to the problem, they document it and they post it on their website. And they do that because they want you to read the website first and try to fix it yourself before calling them. In fact, many times, just as we said earlier, that if you haven't updated to the latest device drivers or critical updates, most of these folks will also say, did you read our website first? And if you haven't done that, they want you to go do that before talking to you. They'll say, well, go check the knowledge base, then come call me if you can't find a solution. So get used to using the knowledge bases on the different websites. They're extremely helpful. If you can't find a resolution there, you can also use Google. I've been surprised at how much information you can get by conducting a Google search. For example, if you have an error occur and you get an error code or an error message, if you copy and paste that error message into Google, put quotes around it so you get an exact text match, and search, more than likely you're going to find a solution to the error because other people probably have had the same problem too. You should also check your hardware. Make sure that your cooling fans are working and that your devices aren't caked with dust. Remember that your PC components carry a charge and that dust is attracted to them, creates an insulator, heats them up. It's a good idea to always go through your cases about, maybe every month or 6 months, depending on how much dust there is in your environment, and clean them out. Get an anti-static vacuum or a can of compressed air and blow that dust out of there. Get rid of it. It creates an insulator that heats these devices up which could cause problems at the worst, or at a minimum, at least shorten the life of the components. You should also run a thorough scan disk on your hard drives on a regular basis. How often? That depends on how heavily the hard disk is used. If you're in an environment where the hard disks get pounded, then you may want to run a scan disk maybe even weekly. If it's a lightly used workstation where folks just check email and type documents, then maybe once a month will be sufficient. In addition, if you're having problems with memory, you can enable memory checking in the BIOS. Now, back in the old days of computers, this was the default. Every time you turned the computer on, the BIOS would go through and check every memory location. It would count the memory. You'd see the memory tick up. That worked great when you had 640K of memory in the system, or maybe 2 megabytes of memory in the system. But when we started looking at 64 megabytes or 128 megabytes or a gigabyte of RAM in the system, that memory check at every boot up became excessive. It took a long time. So BIOS manufacturers usually turned the memory checking off by default in the BIOS, so the system would boot up faster. Well, if you're having memory problems, go into your CMOS setup program and turn the memory checking back on. Yes, it will cause the system to take longer to boot, but it might find those bad memory locations that we talked about. In this lesson, we talked about some things you can do to troubleshoot Windows lockups. We talked about the 3 different types of Windows lockups. We talked about some possible causes for those lockups. And then we talked about some things you can do to help resolve them.